The morning Minnie Abbott walked into the Creed's Crossing livery stable with mud on her boots and steel in her eyes, Matthew Rhodes almost dropped the saddle he was mending. She was not what he expected when old Hector Dunn hollered from the front of the stable that a lady was asking about lessons. Matthew had assumed some rancher's daughter, maybe a merchant's wife new to the territory, someone soft and uncertain. Instead, the woman who stepped through that wide barn door in the late summer of 1882 looked like she had already survived something that would have broken most people, and she carried that survival quietly, the way certain women do, wearing it not as a wound but as a kind of quiet armor. She was 26 years old, he would learn later. Brown hair pinned up practical under a wide-brimmed hat, dark eyes that measured everything in a room before she committed to it, a jaw set firm. She wore a plain cotton dress that had been mended twice at the hem, and her hands, when she pulled off one glove to offer a handshake, were calloused. Working hands, not the hands of a woman who sat idle. "Are you Matthew Rhodes?" she asked. He set the saddle down on the rail and wiped his palm on his trousers before accepting the handshake. "I am. My name is Minnie Abbott. I was told you give riding lessons." He studied her for a moment. Something in the way she said her name had a history attached to it, like she was deciding whether to offer any more than that. "I do," he said, "for the right price and the right student." Her chin lifted just slightly at that. "I can pay a fair rate. As for whether I'm the right student, I suppose you'd have to take that on faith until you've seen me on a horse." He almost smiled at that but caught himself. "Fair enough, Mrs. Abbott. Have you ridden before?" "Once or twice as a girl," she said, and there was something in her voice that made him understand without her saying it, that girlhood had been some time ago, and that whatever riding she had done then was not sufficient for whatever she needed now. "Come back tomorrow morning, 6 o'clock, he said. "We'll start with the basics." She nodded, replaced her glove, and left without any of the pleasantries that usually padded out such conversations. He watched her cross the dusty street of Creed's Crossing and disappear between the general store and the telegraph office, and he stood there in the open doorway of the livery stable for a beat longer than he needed to. Hector appeared at his elbow. "That's the Abbott widow," the old man said quietly. "Her husband Thomas died last spring. Fever took him fast, left her with 40 acres east of town and no hand to work them." Matthew said nothing. He went back to the saddle. But that night, sitting on the narrow porch of the room he rented above the feed store, looking out at the wide, dark Nevada sky with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, he found himself thinking about calloused hands and a jaw set like flint, and the particular kind of determination that settles in a woman's eyes when she has decided she will not be defeated by anything this world throws at her. He was 31. He had been riding horses since he could walk, had worked ranches from Texas to California, had done a stint as a trail hand moving cattle up to the railheads in Kansas, and 3 years ago he had settled in Creed's Crossing because the territory felt right, and because he was tired of moving. He ran the livery stable with Hector and gave lessons on the side and told himself every morning that this was enough, and that he was not lonely, only solitary, which was a different thing entirely. He believed that, most of the time. Minnie Abbott arrived at 6 o'clock the following morning so precisely that he suspected she had been waiting somewhere out of sight, watching the clock. She wore trousers this time, men's trousers cut down and hemmed, practical and slightly shocking for Creed's Crossing, which was not the most progressive of Nevada's small towns. She had a look on her face that dared him to comment on the trousers, and he was wise enough not to. "Good morning," she said. "Morning," he said. He led her to a gentle mare named Copper, a patient animal he used for beginners because she had the temperament of a schoolteacher, calm and forgiving but with standards. "Her name is Copper," he said. "She won't throw you if you're fair with her." Minnie approached the horse the right way, slowly, her hand out low and flat, letting Copper get her scent before she reached for the nose. Matthew noticed that. A lot of people didn't know to do that on the first try. A lot of people reached for the head too quick, which made a horse uneasy. "You've been around horses," he said. "My father had too," she said, stroking Copper's nose with practiced gentleness. We lived outside of Reno when I was small. He'd let me sit up with him sometimes. But I never learned to ride properly on my own. Why now? He asked, and then realized the question might be indelicate. I only mean what changed. She turned to look at him, and for a moment the armor was slightly down. My husband handled all the horse work on the farm, she said. After he passed, I've been managing on foot and borrowing a horse from my neighbor Mr. Calloway when I need to get to town. But Mr. Calloway is moving his operation to Oregon in the fall, and I'll need to get myself to and from town, get supplies, take grain to the mill. She paused. I need to be independent, truly independent. That means I need to be able to ride. Matthew nodded slowly. That was the whole story, and also none of it he understood. What she meant, underneath all the practical sense she was making, was that she was alone on 40 acres and she intended to survive it, and she was not going to ask anyone to rescue her. Right, he said. Let's get you up. She was a quick learner. That was the first surprise. He had taught a dozen students over the years, and most of them, even the ones with natural talent, fought the horse for the first several sessions. They either went rigid and communicated that tension down through their hands and seat into the animal, or they went limp and gave the horse no guidance at all. Minnie found the middle ground faster than anyone he had taught. By the end of the first session, she had a steady posting trot around the paddock, and her hands were already learning the quiet language of the reins. You've got good instincts, he told her after she dismounted, which was the most effusive compliment he generally offered a student. She handed Copper's reins back to him, and there was a faint flush of pleasure on her face, quickly controlled. Same time Thursday, she asked. Same time Thursday, he agreed. She paid him from a small, worn coin purse and walked back toward town without looking back. He stood with Copper and watched her go, and told himself firmly that he was only noting that she was a promising student. Creed's Crossing in the summer of 1882 was a town of maybe 400 souls, the kind of town that had sprung up around a mill and a rail spur and a general store, and had grown just enough to acquire a schoolhouse, a church, a doctor's office, a saloon, and the persistent optimism that things would keep growing. Nevada had been a state for 18 years by then, but the territory around Creed's Crossing still felt raw in places, still felt like the land hadn't quite accepted the presence of all these wooden buildings and wagon ruts. The desert came right up to the edge of the town on 3 sides, vast and patient, and the mountains to the north were snow-capped even in August. Matthew had come to love the land the way you love something difficult, respectfully, with an awareness that it could kill you. He had grown up in Missouri, the youngest of 4 boys, and had come west at 19 with the particular hunger of a youngest son who knew the farm would never be his and that he needed to make his own way. He had done that. He had made his way. He had a reputation as an honest man who knew horses better than almost anyone in the county, and that reputation was worth something. It was not everything, but it was something. On the Thursday lesson, Minnie showed up with a bruise on her left arm that she hadn't had Monday. He didn't say anything about it directly. He handed her a pair of gloves and explained about grip, and she pulled them on, and he noticed how carefully she moved that arm. When she mounted Copper, he watched her face for pain and saw the slight wince she tried to hide. After the lesson, when she was rubbing Copper down, he said, as casually as he could manage, "Everything all right out at your place?" She continued rubbing Copper's flank with the cloth. "Fine. That bruise on your arm looks like a fall." A beat of silence. "I was moving fence posts," she said. "One of them got away from me." He nodded and let it go. He was not in the habit of pressing people, and he understood that she was not a person who invited pressing. But he filed it away, that bruise, the careful way she moved, the fence posts that got away from her. The following Tuesday, he happened to be riding out to check on a friend's property east of town, and he happened to notice from a respectful distance Minnie Abbott's 40 acres. He saw the farmhouse, small and weathered, with a newly repaired section of fence on the south side. He saw the kitchen garden, which was clearly being kept up with some effort. He saw a chicken coop and a small barn. and he saw a man leaning on the fence by the road who he recognized as Dale Prout, one of the Prout brothers who ran a cattle operation 3 miles further east. Dale Prout was not known for being neighborly. He was known for offering low-ball prices on land he wanted and for making those offers repeatedly until people got worn down. Matthew had heard the talk. Some of the smaller farmers who had sold to Prout had claimed afterward that the pressure had been considerable, though the sales had all been technically willing. He rode on without stopping. It was not his business. Minnie Abbott was his student, not his responsibility. But that evening, he stopped in at the general store, which was run by a woman named Clara Finch, who knew everything that happened in Creed's Crossing within hours of it happening. Clara was 62 and had the memory of a court recorder and the discretion of a journalist, which is to say she had none. "Heard anything about the Prout brothers looking to expand?" he asked, examining a tin of saddle soap he had no intention of buying. Clara folded her arms across her apron front. "Dale Prout's been sniffing around the Abbott land since February," she said. "Thomas Abbott wasn't cold in the ground before Dale showed up with an offer. Minnie sent him off. He came back in April. She sent him off again. Word is he came by last week. She's not selling. Not if you asked her," Clara said. "She's holding on to that land with both hands. Thomas's grandfather homesteaded it. She says it's hers and it's staying hers." Clara paused and studied him with the particular attention of a woman who has been watching people for 62 years and is very accurate about what she sees. "Why are you asking, Matthew Rhodes?" "Idle curiosity," he said, and bought the saddle soap he hadn't needed and left. The following Monday's lesson, Minnie arrived looking like she had not slept well. There were shadows under her eyes that had not been there before, and her usual contained composure was a fraction thinner, like paint on old wood, still holding but showing the grain beneath. He took her through the exercises without comment, and then at the end, when she dismounted and stood with her hand resting on Copper's neck in that way she had developed, where she seemed to draw some steadiness from the horse's warmth, he said, "You're doing well enough that we could start working on the trail riding, getting comfortable out in open country rather than just the paddock." She looked up. "Really? You'll need it if you're managing the property alone," he said. "Paddock riding is one thing. But if you need to ride out to check fence lines or get to the mill, you need to be comfortable out in open ground." Something shifted in her face. It was not quite gratitude, because gratitude implies you expected less than you received, and Minnie Abbott didn't seem like someone who expected much of anyone. It was more like relief, the kind you feel when something you were bracing for turns out not to be terrible. "Yes," she said, "I'd like that." They went out for the first time the following Thursday. He took her on a trail he knew well, a wide, flat path south of town that followed a shallow creek bed. He rode his own horse, a big dark roan named Silas, and she rode Copper. And for the first mile he coached her through the transition from paddock footing to open ground, which is its own education. The horse moves differently when it's not enclosed, has different ideas about pace and attention, and the rider has to learn to move with that. Minnie was nervous but competent. She kept her hands steady and her seat correct, and when Copper startled slightly at a jackrabbit bursting out of the brush, Minnie brought her back to calm in 3 strides without panicking. "Good," he said. She exhaled slowly. He could see the pride she was fighting to keep from her face. He liked that she fought it. Vanity about skill was a bad quality in a rider, and she seemed to understand instinctively that being good at something was different from being done learning it. They stopped by the creek to water the horses, and she sat in the saddle looking out over the flat desert plain to the east, which shimmered in the August heat and went on seemingly forever before it met the mountains. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. "I forget sometimes. When you're working all the time, you forget to look at it." "Do you have help at all?" he asked. "On the property?" "Marta Rays comes 3 mornings a week," she said. "She helps with the garden and we put up preserves together. Her husband Eduardo does the heavy labor when he has time, which isn't often. He's got his own place to run." She paused. "I'm learning the rest as I go. Moving fence posts," he said. Her mouth curved just slightly. Among other things, there was a long quiet that was not uncomfortable, which surprised him. He was not generally easy with silence around other people. He tended to fill it or excuse himself from it. With Minnie Abbott, the silence felt natural, which was unusual enough to notice. "Can I ask you something?" she said, still looking at the plane. "You can ask," he said, which was the most honest answer he could give. "Why did you stay in Creed's Crossing? A man with your skill, you could work on any of the big ranches. Carson City, even. Why here?" He considered it honestly. "I got tired of large operations," he said. "Too many horses you never really know, too many hands, nobody seeing the whole picture. Here I know every horse in the county by name and most of their temperaments. It suits me." She turned to look at him then, and there was a directness in her gaze that he found difficult to look away from. "You like knowing things thoroughly," she said, "rather than a lot of things shallowly." "That's a fair description," he said. She nodded as if that answered something she had been wondering about him. They turned the horses back toward town and rode mostly in silence, and he noticed that she sat Copper differently than she had on the way out, more settled, like she had made some decision about trusting the horse, and the decision had freed up something in her body. 2 weeks passed in that rhythm. 3 lessons a week, the paddock work giving way to longer trail rides. He began to notice things about her the way you notice things about land you ride over repeatedly. The small details that only accumulate through time and attention. She always arrived 5 minutes early and spent those 5 minutes talking quietly to Copper before he came out, as if they had their own arrangement. She ate her lunch fast and alone. He had seen her once through the stable doorway when he had come back earlier than expected, sitting on a hay bale with a wrapped cloth containing what looked like bread and hard cheese, eating with the efficient economy of someone who had learned not to waste time on the pleasures of a meal. She laughed rarely, but when she did it was genuine and unguarded, and it changed her face completely, softening everything that was usually held tight. He noticed that he was noticing these things, and he noted that as a development worth being careful about. He was not a man who had avoided relationships out of fear. He had simply never found the right occasion. There had been a woman in Texas, years ago, but she had married a rancher while Matthew was on the trail, and he had understood that the life of a working cowhand was not compatible with the life she wanted. He had thought about it less than he might have expected. He had wondered sometimes if there was something missing in him, some normal human appetite for partnership that he simply lacked. He was beginning to suspect that the appetite was not missing, that it had been waiting. That was a dangerous line of thinking, and he was aware of it. In September, the weather began to turn, the fierce heat of August softening into something more bearable. The evenings came earlier and brought a chill that made the days feel urgently finite. Minnie's riding had advanced enough that she was now confident at the canter, which she had taken to with an enthusiasm that was the closest he'd seen her come to pure joy. The first time Copper had opened up into a full canter, and Minnie had stayed with her, moving with the horse instead of against her. She had pulled up laughing, cheeks flushed, hat nearly knocked back off her head, and for a moment she had looked completely different from the composed, guarded woman who showed up at 6 o'clock with her coin purse and her careful dignity. "That," she said, breathless, "is absolutely wonderful." He found himself smiling before he could prevent it. "You've got a good seat," he said. "You were born to do this, I think." She looked at him, and the laughter faded into something quieter but not less warm. "You say that like you mean it." "I don't say things I don't mean," he said. She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly conversational and then looked away toward the mountains. He told himself it meant nothing. He did not quite believe himself. The trouble arrived on a Thursday in early October, as trouble often does, without warning and during an otherwise unremarkable day. Matthew was in the stable working on Silas's left rear shoe, which had been wearing unevenly, when he heard horses coming fast from the east road. He straightened and stepped to the doorway. 3 riders, and even from a distance he recognized 2 of them as Prute hands, big men who worked for Dale and his brother Carl and were generally seen wherever Dale and Carl wanted someone to feel the weight of their displeasure. The third rider, slightly ahead, was Dale Prout himself. They pulled up in front of the stable with the deliberate theatrical flair of men who want to be seen doing so. "Rhodes," Dale Prout said. He was 45, a large man going to fat but not yet arrived there, with a reddish complexion and pale eyes that were shrewd and not particularly kind. "Heard you've been spending time out east of town." Matthew leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed. "I ride out that way sometimes. Good trail along the creek." "That's so." Prout let his horse shift a few steps. "Heard you've been seen near the Abbott property." "The creek trail goes past the Abbott property, among other properties," Matthew said. "That's because it's a road." Prout smiled without warmth. "I'm just saying, the Abbott woman doesn't need anyone filling her head with notions about holding onto that land. It's too much for one woman alone. She'd do better to sell and get herself set up somewhere easier." Matthew was quiet for a moment. He understood exactly what was happening, and he also understood that this was a warning delivered in the language of frontier sociability, where you said the thing while meaning the other thing and everyone understood both levels. "I teach riding lessons," Matthew said. "That's all I do. What Mrs. Abbott decides to do with her land is her own business." Prout looked at him for a long moment, those pale eyes doing their calculation. Then he nodded once slowly, as if he had received the answer he expected. "Sure," he said. "Just friendly talk." He turned his horse, and the two hands turned with him, and they rode back east the way they had come. Matthew stood in the doorway until the dust settled. He needed to tell Minnie. He didn't want to frighten her, but she needed to know that Prout was escalating from showing up at her fence to warning off anyone who might be seen to be supporting her. That was a different kind of pressure, and she deserved to understand what she was dealing with. The next morning she arrived for her lesson, and he told her plainly what had happened. Standing in the paddock with Copper saddled and waiting, his hands at his sides and his voice even. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, looking at the ground. Then she looked up and her eyes were bright, but not with tears, with anger. "He came to you," she said. "He did, because he thought you might have some influence over me." "I believe so." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "That man has been trying to make me feel small and isolated, and like this land is more trouble than it's worth for 7 months, she said. He came to Thomas before Thomas died, and Thomas told him no. And then Thomas was gone, and Dale Prout showed up 3 days after the funeral with his low offer and his sympathetic face. And I told him no, and I will keep telling him no until he understands that the answer is no." Matthew nodded. "I know. I'm telling you because I think you should know the whole picture. And because," he paused, choosing his words, "if there's anything you need in the way of someone to be there when he shows up, or to go with you to speak to the sheriff, any of that, you only have to ask." She studied him. The anger was still there in her eyes, but something else had come up alongside it, something uncertain and almost afraid, which was the most afraid he had ever seen her. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Because it's the right thing," he said, which was true and also not the whole truth. She seemed to weigh that. Then she nodded and put her foot in the stirrup and mounted Copper in one clean motion and said, "Then let's have our lesson." He mounted Sela's and they went out along the creek trail, and he coached her through the longer approach to cantering from a trot, working on the transition, and she was focused and correct and said very little except what was necessary. And he understood that she was processing what he had told her in the way she processed most things, by putting her body to work so her mind could turn things over. That evening, on his porch, he sat with his coffee and admitted to himself that he had meant more than the right thing when he offered to help her. He had meant that the thought of Dale Prout or anyone else wearing down that woman's fierce, quiet resolve made something in his chest pull tight in a way that had nothing to do with being a good neighbor or a fair citizen or any of the other respectable things a man was supposed to be motivated by. He was not sure what to do with that. He had never in his life handed any part of himself to a person without knowing the ground was solid first, and the ground here was not solid. She was his student. She was recently widowed. She was in a difficult situation that required her to think clearly and not be confused by the attentions of a man she happened to be taking riding lessons from. He resolved to be professional and kind and to keep his feelings, which were still somewhat abstract and theoretical, behind the line where they lived. He managed this for approximately 11 days. It was a Saturday and not a lesson day. He had ridden out to the Calloway place, which was indeed being shut up as old Cal Calloway prepared his move to Oregon, to buy a second horse that Cal was willing to part with at a fair price. He was riding back through town with the new horse on a lead, a solid gray gelding he was already calling Silver in his head, when he saw Minnie Abbott standing outside the general store having what was clearly not a pleasant conversation with Dale Prout. He could not hear the words from where he was, but he could see her face, which was white with the effort of controlled emotion, and he could see the way Prout was leaning into the space between them with that proprietary confidence of a man who believes his size and his money constitute an argument. Matthew dismounted and tied both horses at the rail and walked over. He did not run. He did not raise his voice. He simply appeared at Minnie's side and said, in an ordinary conversational tone, "Everything all right here?" Prout turned, saw who it was, and a calculation passed through his eyes. They were on the main street of Creeds, crossing on a Saturday with perhaps a dozen people within sight. There were limits to what Prout could do here. "Just a conversation," Prout said. "I was just leaving," Minnie said, and the steadiness in her voice was extraordinary. "Good day, then," Matthew said to Prout pleasantly, and offered Minnie his arm in the perfectly ordinary way a man in 1882 would offer his arm to a woman to escort her down the street, which was so conventional a gesture that Prout could say nothing about it. Minnie took it without hesitation, and they walked together down the street until they turned the corner by the feed store and were out of Prout's line of sight. She let go of his arm and stood against the wall of the feed store with her eyes closed for a moment, her hands in fists at her sides. "You all right?" he asked. "I am angry," she said, eyes still closed. "I am so angry I can barely see." "What did he say?" "He said that 40 acres is a lot of trouble for a woman without a husband, and that he's prepared to be very generous, and that perhaps I should think more carefully about what I'm capable of managing alone." She opened her eyes. "As if the question of what I'm capable of is in any way his to answer." "It isn't," Matthew said. "No," she said, "it is not." She straightened away from the wall and some of the color came back to her face. She looked at him. "Thank you for coming over." "I happened to be riding by," he said. The corner of her mouth moved. "You happened to be riding by." "Entirely coincidental." "Of course," she said, and then quietly, "Matthew." It was the first time she had used his given name. He was not sure she even noticed she had done it. He was very sure that he had. She bought what she needed at the general store, and he walked her out and helped her load the supplies into the small wagon she had come to town with, a battered two-wheeled vehicle that he now understood she had been driving herself since Calloway's departure. When everything was loaded, she stood by the wagon and looked at him with that direct, assessing gaze. "Come out and see the property," she said. "I'd like you to see it." He was surprised enough that he showed it, and she seemed surprised at herself for asking. "I mean," she said, "you offered to help if Prout showed up. It would make sense for you to see the land, know what you're dealing with." "That's a practical reason," he said. "Yes," she said. "All right," he said. "When?" "Sunday," she said. "Come for midday dinner if you like." He told himself this was a practical arrangement between a riding instructor and a student in a difficult situation. He believed this somewhat more successfully than he had believed his other recent self-reassurances, perhaps because it was true enough on the surface to be convincing. The Abbott farm, seen up close, was more than he had expected. The house was small but well kept, the kind of kept that comes not from resources but from determination. The kitchen garden was substantial, clearly the result of a great deal of labor, and he could see the rows of preserved jars through the window of the small outbuilding she was using as a larder. The barn was old but sound. The 40 acres spread in two directions. The near portion good flat ground that had been cultivated, the far portion running up toward a gentle rise that caught the afternoon sun beautifully. He understood why she was holding on to it. She made dinner, a proper meal of roasted chicken and vegetables from the garden and bread she had baked that morning, and they ate at the small table in her kitchen, and he told her what he knew about fence repair, and she told him about the 2 cows she was managing, and the difficulty of rotating the garden so the soil didn't exhaust itself. And it was the most natural conversation he could remember having in years. After dinner, she showed him the property lines and the sections of fence that needed the most attention, and he looked at the south fence where she had been moving posts and understood immediately why she had bruised her arm. The posts were far too heavy for one person to manage alone. Those should be a 2-person job, he said. I noticed that, she said dryly. I could come by on a Tuesday, he said, before he had fully decided to say it. Help you get the fence line sorted. She turned to look at him with those dark eyes, and he held steady under the look. Matthew, she said carefully, you already teach me 3 times a week. I won't have you spending your free time on my fence. I don't have a great deal else to do on Tuesdays, he said, which was not entirely true but also not entirely false. She studied him for a moment longer. I'll pay you for the time, she said. You will not, he said. She folded her arms. Why not? He should have had a ready answer for that, and he didn't quite. He looked out across the property at the late afternoon light coming golden over the rise, and he said honestly, because neighbors help each other. That's the simple answer. She was quiet for a moment, and he could feel her deciding something. Then she said, all right, Tuesday. He came on Tuesday and the following Tuesday and the one after that. They worked the fence line together, and he taught her the proper way to set a post so it would hold through winter, and she learned it immediately and did the next one herself while he watched. She fed him lunch both times, simple food but good, and they worked through the afternoon and talked while they worked about anything that occurred to them. Her life before Thomas, which she spoke of briefly, and with a kind of selective memory that told him some parts of it had been difficult. His time on the trail, the ranches he had worked, the places he had seen. Books, which surprised him because she had opinions about books that were sharp and considered, and he had not read as many as she had, but enough to have a conversation that he found unexpectedly stimulating. He began to understand, through these Tuesdays, something that the writing lessons had only suggested. She was funny. Not in the obvious way, not with the broad humor of someone performing for an audience, but with a dry, precise wit that revealed itself in small observations, an exact word, a timing that was impeccable. She would say something that required a moment to land, and when it landed, he would find himself laughing in a way that came from somewhere genuine. He also began to understand something about how she had been living since Thomas died, which was with a discipline that bordered on severity. She allowed herself very few pleasures. She worked because the work was necessary, and she rested only when she had to, and she asked for nothing from anyone and accepted help reluctantly, and only when she had made the logical case for it to herself first. He recognized this pattern because he knew it in himself, the way people who have had to be self-sufficient learn to pull the walls in close and not leave anything exposed. The difference was that he had chosen this way of living, or at least had not been forced into it by grief. She was managing it while also managing grief, and that he thought took a particular kind of fortitude that he genuinely admired. He also thought, on the ride home one Tuesday evening in October, that it was a way of living that did not have to last forever. That walls that had been built for good reason could, when the time was right and the person was trustworthy, be taken down. He thought about that quite a bit. The change, when it came, was neither dramatic nor precisely planned. It arrived, like most real things, in a quiet moment. It was a Thursday lesson in late October, and they were riding the creek trail in the early morning with the desert cold still in the air, and the sky just getting light in the east. She had been cantering ahead of him and pulled up at a spot on the trail where the creek bent, and there was a stand of cottonwood trees with their leaves gone yellow and gold. The light was coming through the trees at an angle that made everything look like the inside of a lantern, warm and suspended. She stopped there and he pulled up beside her, and they both sat looking at it. "I don't think I've ever been out here this early before," she said. "I've been up at this hour 1,000 times, but always inside working." "It looks like this for about 15 minutes, he said. "Then the light shifts and it's just a regular morning." "Then I'm glad to have seen it," she said quietly. He looked at her. The light was doing something to her face that was nothing to do with romance and everything to do with physics. The golden angle catching the fine lines at the corners of her eyes. The particular way a human face looks when it is completely open to something and not guarding itself at all. And Matthew Rhodes, who had held himself in check for going on 3 months, felt something shift in him with a finality that was almost audible. He did not say anything. He was a careful man. He let the moment be what it was, just two people watching morning light in cottonwood trees, and then the light shifted and they rode back and he gave her the lesson and she paid him and left. But he knew. He knew with the certainty of a man who has spent his whole life reading the land and understanding that some things, once you see them clearly, cannot be unseen. He was in love with Minnie Abbott. The question was what to do with that. He was not a man who acted on incomplete information, and the information he had about what she felt was limited and possibly unreliable. She was kind to him. She had asked him to come to the property. She seemed to enjoy his company. But she was a widow less than a year out from losing her husband, and she was in the middle of a difficult fight to keep her land. And she was learning to be independent in ways that were hard-won. And a man who genuinely cared about her would not muddy any of that with his own feelings until he had good reason to believe those feelings were returned. So he did nothing. He continued the lessons and the Tuesdays on the fence line and the occasional shared meal, and he was careful to be nothing other than what he had always been, honest and reliable and present. She came to his rescue before he had to find another way. It was a Tuesday in November, cold enough now that their breath made fog, and they had finished the last section of the south fence and were walking back toward the house. She was carrying the post driver and he was carrying the rolls of wire, and she said out of nowhere, "Can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask," he said, which was what he always said. She was quiet for a few steps. "Have you ever been in love with someone?" He was careful to keep his stride even. "Once," he said, briefly. "A long time ago. What happened?" "She married someone else while I was on the trail," he said. "It was the right thing. I don't think I was what she needed. And since then—" He said nothing for a moment. They had reached the porch of the house and she set down the post driver and turned to look at him. The November light was thin and cold and honest. "Since then," he said, looking directly at her, "I hadn't met anyone who made me want to try." She held his gaze with that directness he had come to expect from her, that way she had of looking at a thing without flinching from what she saw. "And now?" she asked. He breathed out slowly. "Minnie," he said, "I'm trying very hard to be respectful of your situation." She was quiet for a long moment. A crow landed on the fence post they had set that morning and sat there looking at them and then flew off again. The wind moved through the dry grass with a sound like paper. "Thomas was a good man," she said finally, her voice low and careful. "He was kind and he worked hard, and I was grateful to be his wife. But we were practical about each other from the beginning. We were both on our own and the farm needed 2 people, and we suited each other, and that was the truth of it." She paused. "I am not telling you this to diminish what he was or what our life was. I'm telling you because I don't want you thinking that grief is the main thing I'm managing right now." He was very still. "What is the main thing you're managing?" She looked at him with those dark eyes, and the ghost of that rare smile was there at the corner of her mouth. "The realization that I have become accustomed to your company," she said, "in a way that seems to go beyond what a person typically feels for their riding instructor." He let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "Is that so?" "It is very inconvenient," she said. "I had a perfectly good plan for being independent." "Being in company with someone doesn't have to mean not being independent," he said. "I know that," she said. "Intellectually, It's the practical application I'm working out. He stepped closer, not too close, just close enough that the conversation could be quieter. I'm a patient man, he said. I've been patient my whole life. I can keep being patient while you work out the practical application. She looked at him for a long time. Then she reached out and put her hand briefly on his arm, not the way you take someone's arm in the street, but the way you touch something to make sure it's real. Thank you, she said quietly. For being patient. For being you, she said. The particular way you are, which is quite a lot. He covered her hand with his, just for a moment. Then they went inside out of the cold, and she made coffee and they sat at her kitchen table and talked until the sun was low and he had to ride back to town. And nothing was declared, and nothing was promised, but something was understood between them that had not been there before, or rather something that had been growing in the particular silence between two careful people had been spoken into the open, gently, without pressure, and the world had not come apart because of it. He rode home through the cold blue dusk and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Dale Prout made his final move in the second week of November. He arrived at Minnie's property in the early morning with a lawyer from Carson City and 2 witnesses, and a document that claimed Thomas Abbott had owed him a debt that had not been repaid, and that the land, as collateral, now transferred. It was the kind of legal maneuvering that was not uncommon in Nevada in 1882, where the courts were stretched thin and records were imperfect, and a man with enough money could sometimes manufacture a debt that was difficult to disprove quickly. Minnie arrived at the livery stable at noon, not for a lesson, moving fast with her face white as chalk. Matthew listened to all of it without interrupting and then said, "Do you have Thomas's papers?" "His financial records. Everything," she said. "He kept a ledger. He was meticulous. And the ledger doesn't show any debt to Prout." "There is no debt to Prout," she said flatly. "Thomas would never have borrowed from Dale Prout. He knew better than that." "Then we need to get to Judge Harmon," Matthew said, and he was already reaching for his hat. "He's in Creed's Crossing until Friday. He goes back to Carson City after that." "I don't know that I can afford a lawyer," she said. "I know a man," Matthew said. "Come on." The man he knew was not technically a lawyer, but had studied law for 2 years before an injury had sent him west, and he had a working knowledge of Nevada property statutes that was more than sufficient for this situation. His name was Perry Walsh, and he ran the barbershop on 2nd Street, and he owed Matthew a favor from an occasion 3 years ago that was not relevant to the current moment, but which Perry had never forgotten. Perry looked at Prout's document and within 10 minutes identified 3 procedural problems with it, and said confidently that with Thomas Abbott's ledger in hand, he could argue before Judge Harmon that the claimed debt was fabricated. They were in front of Judge Harmon, who was eating his lunch at the hotel dining room and was not pleased about the interruption, but was a man who took his judicial responsibilities seriously, within the hour. The judge reviewed the papers, reviewed Thomas's ledger, asked several pointed questions of Minnie, and then sent his clerk to summon Dale Prout. Prout arrived looking confident and left looking like a man who had miscalculated badly. The judge dismissed the debt claim as inadequately documented, noted in writing that the Abbott property title was clear and unencumbered, and gave Prout a speech about the misuse of legal instruments that was not short and was not kind. Standing outside the hotel afterward in the cold afternoon sun, Minnie looked at Perry Walsh and said, "How much do I owe you?" "Nothing," Perry said, and glanced at Matthew in a way that made it clear who he considered himself to have done this favor for, and then excused himself. She stood on the boardwalk with Thomas's ledger pressed against her chest, and she breathed in and out a few times with her eyes closed, and when she opened them they were bright. "He can't try that again," she said. "Not that way," Matthew said. "And after today I think he'll have a clearer sense of how far he can push. Judge Harmon doesn't take kindly to being interrupted at his lunch." She made a sound that was almost a laugh, and then it became an actual laugh, sudden and unguarded, and he found himself laughing too, the tension of the afternoon breaking apart into something that felt almost like joy. She reached out and took his hand. It was a decisive gesture, not tentative. She took his hand the way she mounted a horse, with commitment and good form. He held her hand on the boardwalk of Creed's Crossing in front of what remained of the afternoon foot traffic, and neither of them felt any particular need to let go. "Matthew," she said. "Yes. I've finished working out the practical application," she said. He looked down at her and felt something warm and spreading move through his chest. "That was fast," he said. "When I decide something, I decide it," she said. "I thought you would have noticed that about me by now." "I noticed," he said. She squeezed his hand once and then let go because they were on the main street of town and propriety still existed in 1882, regardless of what your feelings were doing. And she tucked her ledger more firmly under her arm, and they walked in the direction of the livery stable where Copper was waiting. He boosted her up into Copper's saddle and she looked down at him from above, and the angle was new, her looking down at him. And he had the odd and very clear thought that he wanted to spend the rest of his life in the presence of this particular person. "Come to dinner on Sunday," she said, "and bring that copy of the Dickens novel you mentioned. I want to see if you've actually read it." "I've read it," he said. "We'll see," she said, and turned Copper toward the East Road and rode out of town, sitting the horse beautifully. And he stood in the street watching her go and felt no need whatsoever to pretend he was doing anything else. November became December, and the cold settled in properly over the Nevada high desert, the kind of cold that made the stars look very close at night and turned the ground to iron. Matthew came to the Abbott farm on Sundays without it needing to be arranged each time, and they had lessons 3 times a week still, although the lessons were becoming something more like rides, 2 people going out together into the country, because it was a pleasure to do so. He brought Sela's, and she rode Copper, and they rode for an hour most mornings, and then she went back to the farm to work, and he went to the stable. He also came on Tuesdays and did whatever needed doing on the property, and she had stopped even gesturing toward payment, which meant she had accepted the situation, which he understood to be significant. They read to each other on Sunday evenings by the fire she built in her small sitting room, taking turns with whatever book they were working through, which progressed from Dickens to Walter Scott, to a battered copy of Jane Austen that she produced from a box of books she had apparently been carrying around since before her marriage and loved fiercely. He thought Jane Austen was extremely funny, which surprised her and pleased her enormously, and they had a long conversation about whether Austen was a romantic or a realist, and he argued realist, and she argued that the distinction was false because the real romantic gesture in Austen was always the act of seeing someone clearly and choosing them anyway. He thought that was one of the truest things he had ever heard anyone say. He kissed her on a Sunday evening in December, between Walter Scott and Jane Austen, during a pause in the reading when she had looked up from the page and found him already looking at her. He was not impulsive by nature, but he had been careful for a very long time, and the moment was right, and he knew it. She kissed him back with the same quality she brought to everything, fully and without reservation, and when they separated she looked at him with those dark eyes and said, "I was beginning to wonder if you were ever going to do that." "I was waiting for the right moment," he said. "Was this it?" "Apparently," he said. She laughed and leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat by her fire in the cold December night, and he felt more at home than he had felt anywhere in his 31 years. Christmas of 1882 came quietly to Creed's Crossing. The church held its service, and Clara Finch organized the usual town gathering, and Matthew brought Minnie into town for both in the wagon he had borrowed from the stable, because Minnie's 2-wheeled vehicle was not adequate to winter roads, and he had said so in the practical, non-negotiable tone he used when he had decided something was a matter of safety rather than opinion. They were seen together at the Christmas gathering by everyone in town who mattered, and the news moved through Creed's Crossing in the way news always moved there, which was quickly and with embellishments, but in this case the basic facts were accurate. Mrs. Abbott and Matthew Rhodes, the widow and the horse trainer. Clara Finch, who had suspected this outcome since the morning she saw him ask about Pruett's land interests, was enormously satisfied. Dale Pruitt had gone quiet after the episode with Judge Harmon. He had not returned to the Abbott property, and he had not approached Minnie in town again. Matthew had heard from the sheriff, a solid man named Tate who paid attention to these things, that Pruitt's ambitions in the county were being constrained now by a property dispute on his own land, which was taking up his time and his lawyer's time and a good portion of his financial resources. The pressure on Minnie's property had simply ceased, like weather passing. She was free. And she knew it, and watching her know it was one of the finer things Matthew had seen. Not that she celebrated loudly. She was not a loud person. But there was something in how she moved through the farm in December, something easier, like a person who had been carrying weight for a long time and had set it down and was still getting used to the feeling. The new year came in with snow, genuine snow, which was not unheard of in that part of Nevada but was not common, and Creed's Crossing woke on January 1st of 1883 to a white world that muffled all sounds and made everything look like a different version of itself. Matthew proposed to Minnie Abbott on the 2nd of January, not because he had planned it for a particular date, but because he had saddled Sela's early in the morning and ridden out to the farm through the snow, because he had wanted to see how it looked on her property. And she had come out of the house in her coat with her hair down, because she hadn't expected company, and the snow had turned everything quiet and white, and he had sat on Sela's in the yard, and looked at her standing in the doorway of her farmhouse, and known with absolute clarity that he did not want to live at any distance from this woman, and that saying so was the only thing that made sense. He dismounted and walked to the porch and took off his hat, and she looked at him with a question in her eyes. "I don't have a ring yet," he said. "I should have a ring. But I wanted to ask you before I had one because I didn't want to wait until I had a ring to say what I've been meaning to say." She was very still, watching him. "I love you," he said. "I have been in love with you since probably September, and I tried to be sensible about it for a very long time. I would like to marry you, if you'll have me. I would like to live on this property with you and work it together and be your partner in all the ways that word means. But if you need more time, I will give you more time. I am patient, as I mentioned." She came down off the porch into the snow, and she stood in front of him without her boots and in her coat and her loose dark hair, and she looked at him for a long moment, and he held himself very still. "You rode through the snow to ask me this," she said. "I did, without a ring, because you couldn't wait. Because I did not want to wait," he said. She took his face in her cold hands. "Matthew Rhodes," she said, "I love you. I have loved you for longer than I was willing to admit, and the practical application, as I recall, was worked out in November." She paused. "My answer is yes." He put his arms around her and lifted her slightly off the snow-covered ground, and she laughed that rare full laugh, and he laughed too. The sound of it going out into the white quiet morning, and the snow falling soft around them, and the horse standing patient in the yard, and everything, at that moment, feeling exactly as it should. They stood together in the snow until the cold became impossible, and then she pulled him inside and made coffee, and he sat at her kitchen table, and they made plans the way people make plans when the future feels genuinely open, with enthusiasm and practicality in equal measure. He moved out of his room above the feed store in February. He kept his position at the livery stable, because Hector needed him, and he was not a man who walked away from responsibilities, but he moved his belongings, which were not numerous, a trunk of clothes, his books, his tack, his tools, out to the Abbott farm. It felt natural in the way only the right decisions feel natural, like coming into a room that had been waiting for you. They were married in March of 1883, in the church in Creed's Crossing, with Clara Finch weeping happily in the front pew and Hector standing as Matthew's witness, and Marta Reyes standing with Minnie and Eduardo Reyes, managing to look simultaneously proud and moved. Judge Harmon, who had heard about the marriage and happened to be in town that week, stopped by the church to offer his congratulations, which was the unexpected thing. Dale Prout was not there. He had sold a portion of his own land by then to cover the legal expenses of his property dispute, and his ambitions had contracted considerably. He was in the category of resolved problems, and Matthew had no particular feelings about him, except a mild satisfaction that Minnie's land was safe, and his name was not on it. The spring of 1883 came in green and optimistic. They worked the farm together through April and May, turning over the soil that had been left fallow over winter and extending the kitchen garden and building a second paddock for the horses, because Matthew had brought Silver the gray gelding with him, and Silver and Copper had developed a mutual respect that he found amusing. Minnie continued her riding. She had surpassed what he had originally planned to teach her, and they had moved into territory that was simply riding together for the love of it, working through the techniques of ranch riding, cutting, working cattle, which she had taken to with the same quick intelligence she brought to everything. She was a genuinely fine rider by that spring, which gave him a satisfaction that was both professional and personal and impossible to fully separate. They found a rhythm that fit them. He rose early and tended the horses, and she rose early and started the bread, and they had breakfast together before the day's work divided them. He managed the stock and the heavy labor and rode into town for the stable work 3 days a week. She managed the garden and the preserve-making and the books, because she was better with numbers than he was, and she ran their accounts with the same precision Thomas had kept his ledger. In the evenings they read or sat on the porch in the warm spring nights and talked about everything and nothing. He had not known that domestic life could feel like this. He had expected it to feel like a curtailment, the natural cost of choosing one place and one person, the trade-off of freedom for belonging. What it actually felt like was expansion. Everything was more interesting when you shared it with a person you loved and who was genuinely interesting themselves. The world was bigger, not smaller. She told him one evening in May, sitting on the porch with the smell of the garden in the air and the last light going pink on the mountains, that she had not known either. That she had thought marriage was the word for an arrangement, a good arrangement perhaps, but an arrangement. And, he said, she leaned her head against his shoulder, "And you are a revelation," she said. "You are the most surprising person I have ever met." "I'm not sure I'm surprising," he said. "I think I'm rather straightforward." "That's the surprising part," she said. "I had no idea a straightforward person could be so interesting." He pressed his lips against her hair and said nothing, which was also sometimes the right answer. By late summer, she told him, she was expecting a child. She told him on a Tuesday morning when he had come in from the paddock, and she was standing in the kitchen with a particular expression he had not seen on her face before, something complex and layered, not quite afraid but close to it, and something else, something that was unmistakably hope. He set down what he was carrying and looked at her, and she said, simply and plainly, "I'm going to have a baby, our baby, in the spring, I think." He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and took her in his arms and held her, not saying anything yet, just holding her, because that was what the moment needed before anything else. "Are you happy?" she asked, muffled against his shoulder. "I am," he said, "beyond what I can tell you right now with words." She pulled back and looked at his face, and whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her, because she let out a long breath and smiled, that rare full smile, and the fear that had been in her expression gave way entirely to the hope. They told Marta first, because Marta was at the farm that morning, and because it was impossible to keep anything from Marta, who had noticed 3 weeks ago that Minnie's appetite had changed, and had been waiting with considerable patience for the confirmation. Marta took Minnie's face in both hands and said something in Spanish that Matthew did not fully understand, but understood perfectly, and then hugged them both and began immediately to talk about what Minnie needed to eat and when she needed to rest, because Marta had raised 4 children and was an authority on the subject. Matthew rode into town that afternoon and told Hector, who shook his hand for a long time and said, "Good man," twice, which from Hector was an ovation. He stopped at the general store and told Clara Finch, because not telling Clara Finch would have been a cruelty, and because her joy at the news was so complete and generous that it was a pleasure to witness. The autumn of 1883 was spent in preparation, the practical and the interior kinds happening simultaneously. They made a room, the small room at the back of the house that had been used for storage, into something suitable for a child, painting the walls and building a crib from wood Matthew cut and shaped himself, the work going slowly because he wanted it right, each joint fitted cleanly, and the wood sanded until it was smooth and good. She was well through the pregnancy, which he was grateful for in a way that sometimes stopped him in the middle of what he was doing and required a moment to manage. The fear that lived beneath the anticipation was real, and he acknowledged it because he was an honest man. Women died in childbirth. It happened in 1883 in small Nevada towns more than anyone wanted to count. He had known it happen. He thought about it in the small hours sometimes when she was asleep, and he was lying awake listening to her breathe. And then he would breathe himself and remember that she was strong, and that the doctor in Creed's Crossing was competent, and that worry was not the same as knowledge. She seemed to share neither his fear nor, exactly, his lack of fear. She was practical about it in the way she was practical about everything, doing what needed doing and not adding extra anxiety to what was already a large enough experience. The baby came in April of 1884, on a morning that started with rain and ended clear. It was a boy. A strong, loud, opinionated boy, 8 pounds, and already possessed of a personality, which the doctor confirmed was healthy and well and functioning perfectly. He had a quantity of dark hair that was entirely his mother's and a stubbornness in his expression, even as a newborn, that Matthew recognized because he saw it in the mirror. They named him Thomas James Rhodes. Thomas for the man who had farmed this land before them, who had been Thomas Abbott's grandfather, and whose work had made the farm real. James for Matthew's own father, who was alive in Missouri, and would receive a letter about his grandson within the week. Minnie lay with the baby on her chest in the afternoon light, and Matthew sat on the edge of the bed beside her, and they both looked at this new person who had arrived in the world on a rainy April morning, and who appeared to find all of it acceptable. "He looks like you," she said. "He looks like you," he said. She turned her head to look at him, and her face was tired and luminous and more beautiful than anything he had ever seen. "Matthew," she said, "yes. I am very glad you came into the livery stable that day." He laughed softly. "You came into the livery stable. I'm glad you were there when I came in," she said, with the precise pedantry of a woman who had been right about Jane Austen and knew it. He took her hand and held it, and the baby made a small sound and then settled. And the rain had stopped outside, and the afternoon sun was coming through the window of the room they had painted together in the autumn, falling on the new crib with its carefully jointed wood, and on the woman he loved, and on the boy who was already working out how to be a person, and on Matthew Rhodes, who had come west at 19 with nothing but his own 2 hands and his knowledge of horses and his willingness to work, and who had found, in the most unexpected of places and by the most indirect of routes, everything he had ever needed. The summer of 1884 was warm and long and full. Thomas proved to be a baby who had opinions about schedules, which meant very little sleeping at the expected hours and a great deal of sleeping at unexpected hours. And Matthew and Minnie navigated this together with the pragmatic humor of people who have already demonstrated they can solve problems that are significantly harder than sleep deprivation. Marta came daily that summer, which she had simply decided without being asked, and she and Minnie and the baby occupied the kitchen and garden in what seemed to Matthew, watching from the paddock while he worked with the horses, like a small civilization of women managing things extremely well. He did not feel excluded from this. He felt grateful for it, which he thought was probably the correct response. He had given up the room above the feed store so completely that he sometimes forgot it had been his, forgot that there had been a version of his life in which he sat alone on a narrow porch with cold coffee and told himself he was not lonely. He could not quite reconstruct that version of himself, could not remember what he had done with the evenings, how he had passed the winters. It seemed to him now like a photograph of a stranger, identifiable but remote. Hector retired in the late summer, which had been coming for a while, his hands being not what they were and his back making demands that working in a stable could not accommodate. Matthew bought him out of the livery stable at a fair price that took everything he had saved in 3 years and left him with a small cushion and a large obligation. The stable became his, fully and legally, and he hired a boy named Sam Alcott who was 16 and horse-mad and would learn the rest quickly. He was a business owner. He was a husband and a father. He was a farmer, in the partial way that a man who does the fence lines and the heavy cultivation is a farmer without being the whole farm. He was all of these things, and none of them alone was the thing he was, and the thing he was more than the sum of it. Minnie was back in the saddle by July, which the doctor had cleared, and which she had been waiting for with the focused longing of a person who had discovered something essential about themselves. She rode out with him in the early mornings again, copper patient and glad to have her back, the two horses moving well together through the summer grass. She had become, by this point, a rider who did not require instruction. She had become a rider. He watched her sometimes when she was ahead of him on the trail, the easy movement of her body with the horse's motion, the light hands, the upright carriage that was not stiff but alive, and he felt a proprietary pride that he acknowledged was partly the horse trainer's satisfaction in a student well taught, and partly something else entirely, the particular pride of loving someone and watching them become more fully themselves. She knew he watched her. He could tell because she sat up slightly straighter when she felt his eyes on her, which was not vanity but something closer to acknowledgement, to the pleasure of being seen by someone whose sight you trusted. In the fall of 1884, they had a conversation about the farm and the livery stable and the arithmetic of the future. 40 acres was good ground but not enough to be a full working ranch, and the livery stable was a solid business but not a growing one in a town the size of Creed's Crossing. The question was whether to expand one or both, and in what direction. Minnie had been thinking about this for several weeks. He could tell, because she presented the conversation already containing all the relevant numbers and the most likely scenarios and 2 or 3 options ranked in order of practicality. He loved this about her without reservation, the way she brought her whole mind to a problem and trusted him to bring his, and they were better together at these things than either was alone. They decided to expand the stable and add a small horse-breeding operation, using Silver and a mare Matthew had his eye on, a quarter-horse mare with a bloodline that would produce good working horses. The market for well-bred working horses in the territory was reliable. The investment was manageable. It was a long-term plan, the kind of plan you only make when you are committed to being somewhere, which they were. Thomas learned to walk in November of 1884, which he approached with the same opinionated stubbornness. He brought to sleep schedules and eating preferences, and the question of whether he wanted to be held or put down, but which he mastered with a determination that Matthew recognized and Minnie found endlessly amusing. He walked across the kitchen floor toward the dog they had acquired in September, a mottled brown hound named Judge, who had arrived at the stable looking hungry and stayed, because Matthew could not in good conscience send a hungry dog back out into the Nevada winter. And Thomas reached Judge and grabbed a handful of fur and said something that was not quite a word, but was clearly an opinion. And Minnie and Matthew sat on either side of the kitchen and looked at each other over their son's head, and the look contained everything. Christmas of 1884 was different from Christmas of 1882, which had been the last one he had spent alone, and which he could barely remember except as a marker of a different time. This Christmas was full of noise and warmth, and the dog and Marta and Eduardo and their children, who were old enough to be fascinated by Thomas, and Thomas, who was fascinated by all of them. And a dinner that took most of the day to prepare and was consumed happily and extensively. And afterward Matthew sat with Thomas on his knee by the fire while Minnie played the small parlor organ she had traded a month's worth of preserved goods to acquire from a family leaving for California. An instrument she played with more enthusiasm than precision, but with genuine pleasure, and the dog lay at his feet, and the house was warm against the cold outside. He thought about his father in Missouri, who had received the letter about Thomas's birth and written back with a warmth that surprised Matthew because his father had not been a demonstrative man, had written back to say that he was proud and that he hoped Matthew knew he was proud, which was the closest his father came to saying anything soft. He thought about writing again, and about whether his father might be persuaded to make the journey west. It was a long journey. His father was getting older. But it was possible, and he intended to pursue it. He thought about Minnie's family, which was smaller and more complicated. Her parents long dead and a brother in Sacramento with whom she corresponded but rarely saw. He thought about whether the distance between people could be managed better than it was usually managed, and decided that it could, with enough letters and enough intention. He thought about the farm and the stable and the gray mare they were calling Pearl, who was due to foal in the spring, which would be the beginning of the breeding operation, and the plans he and Minnie had drawn out at the kitchen table on a piece of paper that was now pinned to the wall of the kitchen where they could see it and add to it. He thought about all of it, holding his son in the firelight with his wife playing the organ in the next room, slightly off-tempo but happily, and he thought that this was what people meant when they said they had a good life. Not a life without difficulty or uncertainty or the ordinary sorrows that came for everyone eventually, but a life that was full and true and shared with someone who made every part of it better, and that was worth more than anything else he could think of. The spring of 1885 came in warm and early, the desert greening up in that brief fierce way it had before the summer heat burned it back. Pearl foaled in March, a healthy bay colt that Matthew already knew was going to be a fine horse, and Thomas, who was almost a year old and had strong opinions about everything in his world, found the colt of immense interest and had to be watched carefully around the paddock fence because he was determined to make closer acquaintance. The bay colt was the first of what would become a small reputation for the Rhodes horses, working horses bred from good stock and trained with care, the kind that sold well to the ranchers and farmers of the territory who knew what they were looking at. Within 2 years, there would be 3 more horses with that bloodline working on the ranches north of Creed's Crossing, and people would come to the stable asking for them by name, which gave Matthew a satisfaction he had not anticipated, and that made Minnie look at him in that particular way she had, warm and precise, that told him she was proud, and that she knew he hadn't expected to be. Minnie told him in June of 1885 that Thomas was going to have a sibling, which she announced at breakfast on a Tuesday morning in the same plain-spoken way she announced everything, and then looked at him with the same complex layered expression she had worn the first time, but lighter now, more of the hope and less of the fear. "You're not scared this time," he said. "Less scared," she said. "I know more of what to expect." "Good," he said. "I know you're scared," she said. He looked at her across the table. Thomas was in his chair making a mess of his breakfast with absolute concentration. "Yes," Matthew said honestly, "a little. I noticed," she said, "last time too. You were very careful not to show it. I thought it would worry you." "It didn't. It made me feel less alone," she said. "Being afraid of something together is better than being afraid separately." He thought about that. "Then yes," he said, "I'm scared and also very happy." She smiled. "Good," she said. "That seems about right." The second child, a boy again, came in February of 1886, and his name was William Perry Rhodes. William for no particular historical reason other than it suited him, and Perry for the man in the barber shop who had known property law and done them a favor that mattered. Perry Walsh, when he heard the middle name, appeared in the stable the following Tuesday looking both embarrassed and deeply moved, and shook Matthew's hand for even longer than Hector had. William was different from Thomas in almost every way. Where Thomas had been loud and opinionated from the start, William arrived quiet and watchful, with a disposition that seemed to be studying everything around him with great methodical interest. He was serene in a way that first concerned them, and then, as it became clear he was both healthy and simply a different kind of person than his brother, came to seem like the most natural thing in the world. Two boys, one loud and determined, one quiet and observant. The house accommodated both of them, as it had learned to accommodate everything, by expanding its definition of normal. Thomas, at 2.5, was devoted to the horses in a way that made Matthew's chest ache with something he could only call recognition. The boy was not afraid of them. He stood at the paddock fence and watched with serious dark eyes, and when Matthew lifted him up to stroke a nose, he was gentle and unafraid, and the horses, particularly Copper, seemed to tolerate him with an affection that Matthew could not quite explain, except by saying that horses knew things. Minnie watched all of this from her garden or her kitchen doorway and said very little about it, but he could see what she thought in her face, which was open to him, now in the way the best kind of love opens a person, not making them different but making them more fully themselves. They had built something together that neither of them had fully imagined when they were building it. That was perhaps the nature of the best things. You could not blueprint them from the start. You made one good decision, and then another, and the shape of it emerged from the accumulation of those decisions, and from the particular quality of the two people making them. He had given her riding lessons. He had not planned to give her his heart. But his heart, it turned out, had its own ideas, and they were better than any plan he might have made deliberately. And what had begun in a livery stable on a summer morning with mud on her boots and steel in her eyes had become, through the working of time and honesty and the daily choice of each other, something so solid and true that he could no more imagine it not existing than he could imagine the mountains moving. Creeds crossing grew in those years, as the territory filled and the railroad brought more people west. The town acquired a second general store and a proper hotel and a newspaper, and the faces changed and new families arrived. And through all of it the livery stable was there, and the Rhodes farm was there, and the people who ran them were known as reliable and good, which was the reputation Matthew had always wanted and had never quite said so. In the evenings, when both boys were sleeping and the house was quiet, they sat on the porch in the seasons that allowed it, or by the fire in the seasons that didn't, and they read and talked and were companionably silent. And sometimes she would look at him from across the room with that directness she had never lost, the gaze that saw things clearly and chose them clearly, and he would look back at her and both of them would understand that they were here, fully present in the life they had made, and that it was good. She was not the woman he had expected when Hector Dunn said a lady was asking about lessons. She was better, more complicated, more surprising, more true. She was Minnie Abbott Rhodes, and she sat a horse beautifully, and she kept her books with precision, and she loved with the same thoroughness with which she did everything, holding nothing back once she had decided to give it. He was not the man she had walked into the livery stable expecting either. He was simply the man who had been there, with the right horse and the patience for a careful student and the willingness, when the time came, to offer more than lessons. They had given each other everything without quite meaning to. Or rather, they had meant to, eventually, once the meaning had become clear. And then they had done it fully and without reservation, which was the only way either of them knew how to do anything. On a morning in the spring of 1887, 5 years almost exactly from the morning she had walked into his stable with mud on her boots, Matthew Rhodes saddled Silas and Copper as the sun came up over the mountains, and Minnie Rhodes came out of the farmhouse in her riding clothes with her dark hair pinned under her hat and her eyes already on the horses, and they rode out together across their land and onto the trail along the creek, as they did on most mornings when the weather permitted. Thomas, who was 3 and already making arguments for being put on a horse, stood at the paddock fence with his small hands on the rails and watched them go with his serious eyes. William, 1 year old and conducted by his own quiet investigations, sat in the kitchen with Marta. The trail went south along the creek and then opened onto the flat plain with the mountains ahead, and the morning light coming in clear and clean over everything, and they rode side by side through the spring grass, and the air smelled of sage and something green and new. She looked across at him, and he looked back at her, and nothing needed saying. They rode on through the morning together, the horses moving easy in the good spring air, and the land stretched out in every direction, vast and patient and beautiful, and it was theirs, and they were each other's, and that was the whole of the story, finished and true and closed as firmly as the clasp on a good book, containing everything it needed to contain.